There was additional evidence that was actually considered in this case that we anticipate being presented at trial. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that additional evidence, only to say that we presented a significant but small fraction of our evidence in this preliminary hearing.
And that is going to be key, because the defense highlighted some arguably significant holes in the prosecution's case against singer David for the alleged murder of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. So what we want to do is talk about what those gaps may be and what the prosecution may do. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. I want to do something here. I want to do something very, very specific when it comes to David Anthony Burke, the singer facing first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a minor, and unlawful mutilation of human remains charges in connection with the death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. By the way, I just got to say this real quick. You know, we've been covering this case, but if you're interested in looking at the documents and getting a full 360-degree perspective on this, everything we have, go to the Law&Crime Plus app, because we have a case file section for all of the big cases that we follow. We got one for David, so check it out. A lot of information there that we touch upon a lot here on Sidebar, but if you want to read everything and see it for yourself, it's up there. I want to look at the potential holes in the prosecution's case, the potential gaps. And the reason we're doing this is because we just went through the preliminary hearing. And this gave us a glimpse at some things. And even though, yes, the judge ruled there was sufficient evidence, there was enough evidence for this case to move forward, we know that the prosecution doesn't have to present everything they have at a preliminary hearing. And by the way, DA Nathan Hochman said what was presented by our office over the course of the last week is a small but illustrative fraction of the evidence investigators have accumulated that proves defendant Burke is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the brutal murder of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. And B, the bar is so low at a preliminary hearing, right? You just have to show sufficient cause to hold someone over for trial. It's a different story when you're trying to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, keeping that in mind, I get it that the prosecution didn't present everything. They don't have to, but there are some lingering questions. There are potential gaps in the prosecution's case that were highlighted by the defense or argued by the defense. And the prosecution may need to answer all of that at trial. Now, I actually listed a lot of these out when I interviewed DA Nathan Hochman on my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, the other night. And he said to me, his team is going to have the evidence to address all this. That he said this will be a strong circumstantial evidence case. But what are those potential gaps? What are those potential weaknesses in the prosecution's case that you already saw the defense trying to explore or exploit? That's what I want to get into. Now, let me be very clear about something. Yes, David Anthony Burke, he is innocent unless proven guilty. And even before I go into all the potential holes, the prosecution has already presented some arguably compelling evidence at this preliminary hearing. I mean, when it comes to the continuous sexual abuse charge, in my legal opinion, the prosecution has a lot. If they're trying to prove that David had an illegal sexual relationship with a minor over a period of time, when LAPD detective Corey Farrell was on the stand, he went through all of these alleged sexually explicit photos reportedly on David's phone. I'm not even going to get too specific on this, but basically, it was alleged these were images of the singer engaging in sex acts with Celeste. Naked photos, text messages about Plan B, pregnancy, an abortion, sexual positions, the relationship, emergency contraception. And Farrell says the dates of these conversations with sexual references began all the way back in November of 2023 and continued until March of 2025. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, David's phone at one point purportedly texted, because, you know, I can't say definitively that David was saying this, right? It's David's phone. Maybe the defense would suggest that somebody else was using it. Maybe tough to argue. David's phone apparently sends a message to Celeste's phone, and it's basically a message asking if it's his. So you would basically make the argument that you're talking about a baby. Celeste's phone responds, "Of course it's yours, David." And to be clear about what a defense could be, and this came out during the preliminary hearing, where Deputy DA Beth Silverman, the prosecutor in this case, made the point that even if Celeste had lied to David about her age, it doesn't matter. it doesn't absolve him of criminal liability, that is still sexual abuse of a child. Now, I will tell you, I haven't seen any case law to dispute that, but I'm sure the defense will explore that. We'll see. Now, in terms of the alleged dismemberment charge, unlawful mutilation of human remains, detectives testified about these chainsaws, a mop system, cadaver bags, a blue inflatable pool that were all allegedly ordered to David's home using an alias in the days after Celeste's reported death. How a DNA expert testified that evidence from apparent bloodstains in the home's garage were consistent with a DNA match for Celeste, that you had a criminalist testify about mats at David's place that had linear cuts and stains that tested positive for possible blood, evidence of an alleged trash bag with stained wipes, alleged cuts to this blue inflatable pool, how blue plastic fragments found in Celeste's remains are allegedly consistent with the inflatable pool that David reportedly ordered and that was found at David's place. That David's Tesla, where Celeste's remains were found, reportedly had 11 air fresheners in it. How testing found possible traces of blood in the car. Silverman suggests that blood could have leaked from the parked Tesla, soaked through the rubber mats, and reached the bricks underneath. And what about the testimony that allegedly right after this supposed killing, during the night of the 23rd into the morning of the 24th, digital data allegedly shows the Tesla traveling to Santa Barbara, that Celeste's passport card was allegedly found in Santa Barbara County. Now, I say all of that to say that the prosecution definitely has evidence in this case that will challenge the defense, but that doesn't take away from the central point of this episode. I want to look at the potential issues, the potential gaps, the potential holes in the prosecution's case. So first of all, I got to just lay this out. The first gap for me is the murder charge. We definitely don't know what happened in that house right now. What came out? Detective Farrell confirms that there was no surveillance video of Celeste or David at the residence that night. There was no presentation of witnesses seeing Celeste enter that home on Doheny Place. And while the prosecution asserts that David arranged for an Uber to pick Celeste up that night to take her to his place, and reportedly there was a text conversation about that, including texts about the address, the Uber's arrival, the gate door being unlocked, apparently the Uber driver could not definitively say that he dropped Celeste off at this house. Detective Farrell testified that nobody saw Celeste get out of the Uber that night. No one testified, as of yet, that they saw the killing or watched Celeste die. There were no witnesses called regarding that specific 20-minute or so period of time, that window at night when prosecutors believe Celeste was murdered after allegedly arriving at David's place. Now, what could the prosecution do? They could couple the text message exchange between Celeste and David with location data on the phone, potentially map it to the purchase of items from David afterwards, or allegedly from David afterwards, and use the allegation that there is no more activity from Celeste's phone to put out a timeline of when she allegedly arrived and when she was allegedly killed. That's how they even get to that 20-minute window. And yes, cases can be brought and won on circumstantial evidence alone. You and I both know that. You don't always need direct evidence like surveillance footage or an eyewitness, but we're talking potential gaps here. And that brings us to another important point. Assuming she goes into the house, what happened? How do you know it was first-degree murder with special circumstances? Neither Detective Farrell nor the deputy medical examiner could precisely say what happened. And that is complicated by the fact that no murder weapon was ever recovered. And to give you an idea of what I mean, you go to the cross-examination of Dr. Grant Ho, this deputy medical examiner that I mentioned. This is when the defense was questioning him, because the defense asked if advanced decomposition, which we have in this case, can affect the accuracy of drug results in toxicology testing. The witness says potentially. The defense asked if it's helpful to know whether a person has a mental health history, whether they're suicidal, whether they're a habitual drug user while preparing an autopsy report. The witness says potentially. Dr. Ho didn't apparently speak with relatives about these characteristics or potential characteristics. And the defense, as far as we could see, seemed to insinuate on cross-examination, is it possible that Celeste may have stabbed herself, that she may have done something to herself? You know, defense attorney Marilyn Benarski had Dr. Ho establish that he cannot rule out that the two penetrating wounds which he claimed were the cause of death, occurred within seconds of each other. Quote, you cannot determine whether Ms. Hernandez was holding the knife that caused the 2 wounds, correct? Correct. You can't rule that out, right? So that is a consideration, but we would expect to find hesitation marks. And then he was asked, is it fair to say that you don't know the circumstances under which these wounds occurred? And he replied, correct. Assuming, of course, it's a knife, right? We don't have the murder weapon. That leaves room for reasonable doubt. That leaves room for the defense to explore. And we have to imagine the defense could bring in their own pathologist to testify to maybe a different cause of death rather than multiple penetrating wounds, or maybe even a different manner of death other than homicide. Now, where do they get this idea of her allegedly doing this to herself? Well, you heard that line of questioning about mental health, right? It was reported that the defense attorney asked Detective Farrell if Celeste had a history of domestic violence, whether there were messages referencing alleged mental health issues about Celeste. And while the judge wouldn't permit the presentation of that evidence at this stage of the proceedings, it is possible that could come out at a trial. But you couple that with the text messages, or the apparent text messages from April 22nd to the 23rd, 2025. Again, this is the time period that we're talking about, the key moment when Celeste was allegedly killed. These were highlighted by the defense on cross-examination of Farrell. They arguably show that Celeste was demanding to see David before he traveled abroad, that she begged to see him in person, that he tells her no. This would defeat the narrative that he allegedly lured her to the property to kill her. And then Detective Farrell seemed to confirm that David says, okay, agrees to see Celeste on April 23rd, 2025. And after she sends him this text, cut this S out, I'm seeing you today. Now, Blair Burke, David's attorney, reads this allegedly threatening text from Celeste that was dated April 22nd, allegedly telling David that she will end his career and tell her father, quote, so many lies about him, that she's going to mutilate his quote, I will tell my dad so many bleeping lies about you, dead ass. I will end your career and your life. I will damage anything. She allegedly sent this on April 22nd. Now, Burke apparently also read a text from Celeste explicitly threatening to make anonymous accusations and, quote, leak all that S I got on you. And this is apparently in reference to whether or not David was going to post on Asia Collins' social media accounts showing the two of them together. There seemed to be an insinuation that she was jealous of this person. Asia Collins is somebody who we've talked about before, apparently in David's orbit. And Celeste apparently told David she has his contact information, his mother's number, threatening to release all this information. And then you have texts like this where Celeste allegedly wrote to David in August of 2024, I care about you. I killed my kid for you. I don't like talking about it because it gets me really upset, but I do anything to have it back. So why does this matter? Why is this all important? Well, here's the point. Yes, the prosecution can point to messages like that to say, yeah, she was threatening to expose him and ruin his career. He had a motive to kill her. So to protect his career, he lured her over and he killed her. After all, the prosecutors say his debut album, Withered, that was part of a $19 million deal with Interscope Records, that was set to release just a few days later on April 25th. So it goes to the special circumstances allegations, a part of the murder charge, right? That would lead to more severe penalties, possibly the death penalty, killing for financial gain, killing a witness, lying in wait, special circumstances, right? But the defense could also argue that she was the one who initiated this, that she begged to come over, that she became hysterical, that she became erratic, that she had mental health issues, and that she did something to herself that night. That maybe she attacked David. That maybe he engaged in self-defense. Did she attack him? Did she threaten him? Will he take the stand and argue that? Was it a heat of passion killing, right? Is this manslaughter? Heat of the moment, not a premeditated murder. Is there an area for reasonable doubt? Because we don't have more information right now about what exactly happened in that 20-minute window, allegedly behind closed doors between Celeste and David, when she allegedly arrived at the home and when David is accused of sending an alibi text, right? They say 20 minutes or so after she arrives, he sends an alibi text asking where she was. There's a gap here. There's potential room. And I got to call something out here too. If you recall, in one of the prosecution's filings, they alleged that David stood by while Celeste bled out. How do they know that? How are they going to prove that? It wasn't like they called an eyewitness who saw that. It wasn't like they had surveillance footage to prove that, at least as of yet. How can they allege that? How can they allege that this was first-degree murder with all these special circumstances? Actually, let me highlight something else from the defense during questioning of the deputy medical examiner. Because when you think about the state of decomposition and dismemberment, that's an issue. Dr. Ho testified that he's willing to say she had been dead for weeks, because there are weeks and months, But he couldn't say that she had been dead for months because there are no months and weeks. I know it's a little technical, but in other words, you have a witness who can't say certainly how long Celeste had been dead before her remains were discovered. So he cannot pinpoint the exact date of her death as April 23rd, 2025, based on the autopsy. And if the defense can convince the jury that she was alive past April 23rd, that's going to be significant. Now, where do I think the prosecution is going to go with this? What do I think the prosecution is going to do to respond to all this? Here's what I think. And this is, by the way, based on my conversation with DA Nathan Hochman on my News Nation show, too. I think I was reading between the lines with what he said. I imagine the prosecution would argue, jury, are you expected to believe that Celeste invites herself over, kills herself, and David thinks that quickly, that only minutes later he sends an alibi text? He doesn't think to call emergency services or the police and tell them what he just witnessed, what just happened? Jury, are you expected to believe he's minding his own business when Celeste violently attacks him, he kills her in self-defense, and then calmly sends an alibi text afterwards? He thinks that quickly, and then allegedly buys all the supplies to allegedly dismember her body? They're going to argue it doesn't make sense. They're going to argue, no, he had a plan in mind. He wanted to kill her, that he did murder her, that he did try to cover it up. I mean, let me highlight a few things that came out in the preliminary hearing, because the prosecutors claim that at 10:31, so the night that she comes over, the night that they claim he killed her, he sends this alibi text. Uber said, you're here. WYA, where you at, right? Hello, bro, all these texts. And Detective Farrell testified that the texts from David to Celeste continue that night, that there's around a dozen texts from David to Celeste after her Uber arrival, after she arrives at the home. This is the allegation. Again, all about David purportedly confused about her silence. And Farrell testified that there was no additional activity from Celeste's phone after she arrived. Why? The allegation would be because she's dead. And Farrell testified that David's Tesla, the phone, left the Hollywood Hills residence around 11:30 p.m. to make these purported Santa Barbara trips, right? Farrell says the defendant's last text message to Celeste to her phone was April 26, 2025. So this was the day after his album Withered was released. So you have two things, right? You have no more activity from Celeste's phone. David never texts her again. They would argue suspicious. They would say he really has nothing to do with this and he just never contacts her again. Or does he never contact her again because he killed her, because he knows what happened to her? Prosecution will probably say, we don't need to show you exactly what happened in this house. It's obvious. It's a strong circumstantial evidence case. And you and I both know how many times that we've covered cases here on Sidebar where the prosecution wins on a circumstantial evidence case. But again, there are arguable gaps here that the defense would exploit. You got to wonder, is the prosecution going to address all this? Is there a witness that's going to testify about what they saw, about what they heard, about what David maybe told them? Maybe? And just continuing our conversation about potential gaps. I mean, aside from the lack of an alleged murder weapon, what exactly did David allegedly use to dismember Celeste? Because prosecutors allege that David ordered 3 chainsaws to this home, but the 2 that were found in the garage in this residence didn't test positive for blood or DNA. Same for an electric saw that was found. There was testimony suggesting that a criminalist posited that if the blades had been used for human dismemberment, they wouldn't have been able to be cleaned to a point where their testing would have resulted in a negative result. And what I'll note about that is the deputy ME, Dr. Ho, testified that certain dismemberment is potentially consistent with chainsaw cuts. So what's the disconnect here? Well, one of the things prosecutors talked about was this third missing chainsaw. And they presented product photos of this Makita brand 10-inch chainsaw, apparently from Home Depot, apparently delivered by Postmates. But detectives confirmed that the chainsaw wasn't at the place. As far as we can tell, they don't have it. I mean, is this the one? Is this the one that he allegedly used to dismember Celeste? Because if you don't have the tool, that's a gap. Now, I asked private investigator Steve Fisher about this after the preliminary hearing. He was actually in that preliminary hearing for a bit of it. He had been following the case from the very beginning. Here's what he said about the chainsaw.
Well, the medical examiner said, because of the state of decomp, they can't say for certain exactly like how long of a blade or sharp instrument that was or whatnot. And listen, I think everybody assumes it was probably a knife, but there was a lot of time that passed in between. So it's mind-boggling to me that there was any evidence such as pool or anything still in that garage. I mean, the stupidity, right? If you're trying to cover this up. And part of me wonders, like, if he just knew he was going to get caught and was just kind of waiting, because this was
do you think the missing chainsaw is the key?
Yeah, I think that chainsaw might be in Santa Barbara. You know,
Really?
I think on the second or third trip, I think he could have been, getting, because if you look at that second trip, they're contending that it happened around like May 5th, around Cinco de Mayo. And May 8th, I think he took another trip up there. And that makes me wonder if it was to dispose of things near that lake or something. But I don't know that for sure. I just think that could be a reason that the ID was ultimately found up there as well. It's like a disposal spot. But why he picked that, how he knew about that place is really my mug. Because I've been there. It's remote. It's just a road that really goes through that area. The roads that go off of it, there's some to go to like a Boy Scout camp and stuff like that. But they're not well-traveled roads. So I don't know how he even knew about this place in the middle of the night.
And I asked DA Nathan Hochman about the missing chainsaw too. And since this is an ongoing case, he really wouldn't give me much about it. But my personal opinion is, if they had the chainsaw, wouldn't they have presented it during the preliminary hearing, right? If they did, and they could show it was used in the dismemberment, they would have presented it. Particularly if they find a chainsaw in Santa Barbara where David is accused of going to, and maybe they could find something between now and trial. Maybe they could find this alleged murder weapon. Maybe they could find the chainsaw. I don't know. But when you talk about gaps, we didn't hear any eyewitnesses definitively saying it was David driving the car to Santa Barbara. Could someone else have used his phone? Could someone else have been using his car? I think another gap is just the lack of witnesses to what they saw and heard. I go back to the prosecution's filing. Prosecutors alleged that David lied to friends and associates about the alleged smell of decomposition at his home, at his residence. But I don't recall anyone testifying to that. We didn't see Asia Collins. We didn't see Neo Langston testify, purported friends, associates of David. I mean, you go back on July 4th, 2025, according to TMZ, there was a live stream that apparently showed David telling his friends, Neo Langston and Usgana, about this smell in his house, saying he apologized for how his bathroom smells, claimed that he went to the bathroom 2 hours earlier. Is that going to be presented by the prosecution to say he's lying about what the smell was? So a gap for me is, what would they testify to? If you recall, Neo was reportedly arrested for failure to appear as a witness and was seemingly brought back to LA to testify before a grand jury. We know there was an effort to subpoena David's family members too to testify. None of that happened at this preliminary hearing. Gaps. What would they testify to? Would they testify about the purported illegal sexual relationship between David and Celeste? Would they testify about the Tesla? I don't know. But again, the prosecution is under no obligation to present everything they have at a prelim. Remember, Hochman said a small fraction of evidence. And when you think about what those in his orbit, David's orbit, could testify to, one of the potential deficits in this case is that I don't recall any testimony yet that David texted or communicated with anyone about an intent to kill Celeste, or that he was afraid of her, or that he wanted to keep her quiet, or that he admitted to anything. Is that going to come out? Maybe. I mean, I just go back to what attorney Bednarski, defense attorney, said to the court at the prelim. After days of testimony, the evidence only shows a young woman's body was transported and concealed. And while this circumstantial evidence supports concealment of a death, it doesn't support a killing or the requisite intent, forethought that would make it first-degree murder, that the law recognizes two forms of malice. And her argument was neither. And then if you don't have either, there's no murder. Express malice was a deliberate intention to take away a life, and she argued there was no evidence showing deliberate intention here from David. She argued there's no statement of intent anywhere to harm her. There was no history of violence or hostility from him to her. How the relationship, the evidence listed here, is the opposite of homicidal malice. She also argued there was no implied malice. There was no considerable provocation. And she says, counter that, if you look at provocation, it was from Celeste to David, that she was the threatening one. She argued that the three special circumstances allegations that would make this first-degree murder charge eligible for the death penalty are unconstitutionally vague. How lying in wait, you look at the text messages that were presented, would arguably show Celeste called for the meeting during which prosecutors claimed she was killed. There was no surprise attack because she knew and expected David to be home, that he was online playing games when she came over there, or allegedly came over there. The other special circumstance allegation, murder for financial gain, she made the argument that David's prospective music career is not a concrete financial interest under California law, that there's no California precedent for anticipated future earnings. I think this one might have been a difficult argument, though, for the defense, considering you learned how much money he was making and he had his album. What about the third special circumstance, murder of a witness? Well, she argued there was nothing that showed a subjective belief that Celeste had any interest in being a witness or participant in any criminal investigation. Did she make it clear that she was going to work with prosecutors or work with police or go to the police? And she argued that all of Celeste's threats were to ruin him socially and professionally. Again, that she never said she was going to go to the police. Now, the prosecution countered that. The judge ultimately ruled there was enough to go forward for trial for now, but I'm highlighting what could be issues at a trial. Look, the next thing that we have to look out for is David's arraignment on August 31st. That's going to be the formal reading of the charges. We'll get a sense of the next steps in this case. Although, let me just call out one more thing. I asked Nathan Hochman on my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, about a plea deal here. Now, I didn't mention, would you consider a deal because of gaps in the case? No, because he feels very confident in the evidence. He knows more about it than I do. He feels very confident that they can find David guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. No, I asked him, if you think about what was just presented at this prelim, the graphic photos of Celeste's dismembered body, the allegedly sexually explicit photos of Celeste, do you want to spare a jury from all that? Do you want to spare the family from all that? He hasn't mentioned the death penalty yet, right? Whether or not they're going to go forward. Are they pursuing it? Is it a bargaining chip? In other words, DA, would you possibly consider a plea deal, or do you want to take this to trial? And DA Hochman told me that David is free to make an offer. We'll see what happens. That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check us out on NBC's Peacock as well. If you want to follow me, X, Instagram, my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. Eastern. See you next time, everybody.